Well, the candidate field is largely set for November's general election, with North Carolina once again to be the subject of talk and intrigue as a battleground state at the national level, and with all sorts of fascinating races for statewide office here in our state. Carolina Journal is covering all the key races. Rick Henderson is editor-in-chief. He joins me now with a look at some of these very interesting matchups. Rick, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Donna.
All right, we're going to have a race for governor of North Carolina,
Yes.
and we know that Democrat Roy Cooper, the incumbent, wants another term, but now he's got a real challenger.
Yes, Dan Forrest, two-term lieutenant governor, won his primary, I think by a somewhat surprising margin. He's running against Representative Holly Grange from New Hanover County. Forrest got 90% of the vote in the primary, which was very interesting because he got a higher percentage of the vote than Roy Cooper got in,
Right.
in his race against Ernest Reeves, who essentially was a placeholder on the ballot. I think Ernest Reeves had something like $1,000 worth of spending in his campaign, and Roy Cooper had who knows how much. But it's Forrest versus Cooper, the race everyone's been expecting since about January of 2017, and so we will see what happens here.
Those are two people with pretty different views on a number of issues. Any thought, Rick, as to what might be the key issues that will come out in this race?
Well, Governor Cooper is going to run against the General Assembly, basically, and against Dan Forrest as a proxy for the General Assembly, since as the lieutenant governor, he is the president of the Senate. But also, Cooper gave indications in his victory speech on election night that he was going to be on the road a lot, campaigning for Democrats up and down the ballot. So he's going to be someone who is not just concerned about his campaign, but about the fate of Democrats primarily in the General Assembly, where the Democrats are not too far away from being able to conceivably take majorities.
And one big factor that will impact those down ballot races will be, most analysts would say, who the nominee for president is from the Democratic Party. Right. And at the time you and I are talking, we don't know yet.
No, we don't. We know that the Vice President Joe Biden got a big surge out of Super Tuesday, and that privately there are a lot of Republicans who would be very happy if Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont were the Democratic nominee, because it would be easier for down-ballot candidates to run against Sanders. Then they wouldn't necessarily have to run against their Democratic opponents. They would just simply say, well, you want to elect a socialist. They would be trying to put their opponents on the defensive. With Vice President Biden as a candidate, that's harder to do. You can certainly run on the record that the Vice President has in his position on the issues, but it's much easier to say running against a socialist rather than running against a former Vice President who's on the left.
And on the Republican side, it would not be a cakewalk for Dan Forrest with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, because there's certainly controversy over President Trump and his behavior, the things he says and tweets, etc.
Right.
Likely the Democrats would say to Dan Forrest, hey, you're embracing the President of the United States, who is divisive in their view.
Well, and that's why the Sanders pick, if it is Sanders, the Democratic side, neutralizes that to a large extent, because both of them, both Senator Sanders and President Trump, are very polarizing figures in their own way, unifying to their base, but they are certainly not shrinking violets. And so it's the sort of situation that will make it the dynamic change completely depending upon whom the Democrats nominate.
A lot of calculations likely to go on behind the scenes with their campaign strategists as to how to handle it, depending on how things look at the top of the ticket. Well, for the number 2 job in North Carolina, Lieutenant Governor, this is really fascinating, because at the time you and I are talking, we have one candidate for sure for the Republicans, Mark Robinson, but we're not quite sure on the Democratic side.
Right. Representative Yvonne Hawley of Wake County took the lead, won about 26% of the vote. The winning candidate needs 30% to avoid a runoff. And she's going to be running against Senator Terry Van Dyne from Buncombe County, who had just barely finished in second place. It was a very tight race among the top 3 contenders. And Senator Van Dyne advertised very heavily, outspent Representative Hawley by a lot, and still did not come through. I think one of the subtexts of of the Super Tuesday election was that Wake County performed really, really well. I mean, Democrats in Wake County did great, and Democrats I certainly provided the margin of victory or the margin of lead for Yvonne Hawley. And this is going to be an interesting race because a lot of Democrats are asking Terry Van Dyne not to request a runoff. And as of the time we're recording this, that decision hasn't been made yet.
What about on the Republican side? Mark Robinson, that may be a name unfamiliar to some of the electorate.
Yes, he is a political activist, African-American political activist from the Greensboro area, strong Second Amendment supporter. He gave a very fiery speech before the Greensboro City Council about his Second Amendment rights and the like.
And that went viral.
That went viral. He won 32.5% of the vote in a field of about 12 candidates, which is which unusual in a lot of ways. For one thing, the high-profile people who were also running, former Congresswoman Renee Elmers was in the race. Mark Johnson, the superintendent of public instruction, was in the race. A couple of members of the General Assembly who spent a good deal of money didn't score in very highly in that. And so it's very likely that if we don't have a runoff on the Democratic side, we're going to have our first African American lieutenant governor, perhaps in a long time, if not forever. I'm not sure what happened in the 19th century. I can't recall right off the top of my head. But so that would be a landmark election. The other thing too. In discussions, I was thinking about, Mark Robinson's not really well known in a lot of Raleigh political circles, and this candidacy reminds me a little bit of Representative Mark Walker in the Greensboro area, who had an incredible on-the-ground grassroots campaign when he surprisingly won both the primary and the election in the 6th Congressional District. I believe it was in 2014. And people didn't know him, but he really worked the grassroots well, and I think Mark Robinson has done the same thing, and so it's going to be a very interesting race in that regard.
You mentioned a name that is now essentially out of a job, and that is Mark Johnson, who is the current superintendent of public instruction, but he wanted to be lieutenant governor, but he did not fare well at all in the Republican primary, so he's out of elective office.
Right, only got 12% of the vote. And so a lot of people were wondering why he actually chose that race, because it's really difficult to defeat an incumbent Council of State member who runs for re-election. It happens very rarely. Mark Johnson was one of the people who did it, actually, and when he won against June Atkinson back in 2016. But for now, he's out of elective office, or at least he will be as of January.
Now, the job that he has right now, superintendent of public instruction, the fact that he ran for lieutenant governor meant that was an open seat.
Right.
And we now have 2 candidates who have won their races. The Republican nominee is Catherine Truitt. The Democratic nominee is Jen Mangrum.
Catherine Truitt is the chancellor of Western Governors University's North Carolina campus. She defeated Craig Horn, long-serving representative from the Mecklenburg County area, who spent a lot of money on the race. And then Jen Mangrum is a UNCG professor who ran against Phil Berger, the Senate leader, as a Democrat, and didn't fare very well. But nonetheless, she's got some notoriety from that race.
You have to wonder, considering that in North Carolina, we know that year after year we talk about how the whole governance of the education system, the K-12 system in the state, is really murky. Wonder if these 2 candidates will weigh in on that in addition to policy issues.
Right. That's going to be a big concern. Is that what do they think about the way the schools ought to be structured and the finances ought to be structured, too?
Another race to follow. Of course, Carolina Journal will be reporting on all of these, so you need to stay on top of that at carolinajournal.com. Also, if you are on Twitter, it is at Carolina Journal. Rick Henderson is editor-in-chief, and you're on Twitter as well.
At Deregulator.
All right. Rick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.